On Westmount Road in Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, the Watkins family lived in a modest home that had seen its fair share of struggles. At the center of it all was Kevon Watkins, a teenager caught in the turbulent years between boyhood and manhood. He was 16 and shared the home with his mother, Latoya Watkins, who did her best to keep the household together despite the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. His 13-year-old brother, Kay Watkins, lived there as well. Then there was Alexus Brianna Watkins, his 19-year-old sister, who was engaged and had her son but was still trapped under her mother's roof. Kevon was a student at Westside High School in Macon, Georgia, and had no history of bad behavior in school, but one thing he was known for was his love for video games. He preferred it more than his daily meal. Video games, like other human indulgences, can be very addictive, and in Kevon's case, his love for playing video games was no longer a hobby or a passion. It was now an addiction, an obsession he couldn't live without. Like every addiction, a denial of it can push the subject into a whirlwind of behavior. The evening of February 2, 2018 was calm in the Watkins household. Everything seemed normal, except for one frustration that disrupted the peace. The internet was slow. Everyone was at home, they were all managing the poor network, but Kevon was not having it. He was not getting his daily shot of dopamine from his video games. The network was so slow he couldn't even load his Xbox, a gaming platform that allows players to connect online and play video games together. The more he tried, the more frustrated he became, and like a crack addict, he needed to get his fix quick. So he proceeded to turn off the router and then change the password so that no one else in that house will have access to the internet, aside from him. He felt that multiple people connecting to the router contributed to the network being slow. Latoya Watkins had had enough. Her son's selfishness had crossed a line. Without hesitation, she marched into his room, yanked the router's plug from the wall, and grabbed his Xbox. Kevon spun around, eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you doing?" His voice cracked with rage. "You don't get to control the internet for yourself," his mother snapped. "If you can't share, then you don't get to play." Kevon stormed after her, fists clenched. "Give it back." He grabbed for the console, but Latoya pulled away. "Then," he snapped. His voice turned into a feral scream as he lunged at her, trying to rip the console from her hands. His mother staggered back, struggling to keep hold of it. That's when Alexus stepped in. "You can't talk to Mom like that," she shouted, moving between them. Kevon's breathing was heavy, his whole body tense with frustration. "Move, Alexus." His voice was a warning. She didn't budge. "Calm down, Kevon. This isn't that serious." But it was to him. He shoved her, not hard at first, just enough to push her back. But Alexus didn't back down. "Stop acting like a child," she snapped, planting her feet firmly in place. Kevon's face twisted with frustration. His emotions boiled over, untamed and uncontrollable. He lunged again, this time grabbing her arms, trying to force her out of the way. She struggled against him, trying to push him back, but he was stronger and angrier. In a flash, he wrapped his arm around her neck and pulled her down to the floor. The chokehold tightened. Alexus gasped, her fingers clawing at his arm. "Kevon, stop," she choked out, struggling beneath his grip. Their mother screamed, rushing forward, hands pulling at Kevon's shoulders. Their younger brother tried to pry his arms off Alexus, but Kevon wouldn't let go. His muscles were locked, his grip tightening with each passing second. Alexus thrashed, her legs kicking wildly. She clawed at his skin, her struggles growing weaker. Latoya's heart pounded. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was life or death. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone. The clock read 5:17 p.m. "He's being disorderly," she gasped to the 911 dispatcher, her breath coming in frantic bursts. "He won't listen. He's disobedient." Tears blurred her vision as she pleaded into the phone. "Please send help before something happens to my daughter." As the minutes ticked by, the situation spiraled further out of control. Then, another call came in. This time it was their younger brother, Kevon Watkins. His voice was frantic, words spilling out in a panic. "He's got Alexus in a chokehold," he gasped, the horror of what he was witnessing evident in every syllable. "She's knocked out." A pause, just a second, maybe two. Then his voice came back, more desperate now. "He's threatening to beat our mom." Somewhere in the background, the muffled sounds of chaos bled into the call. The scuffle, the desperate cries, the sounds of furniture scraping against the floor. Latoya, who had once called for help because she couldn't control Watkins, was now fighting to pull him off Alexus. But it wasn't working. "He's still on her!" Kay shouted, his voice rising in fear. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, tried to get details, but there was no calming this. The moment had already gone past the point of reason. It was 5:30 p.m. when Deputy Isaac Munguia pulled up. At the front door, Latoya Watkins stood waiting, her face tense, her breath quick. She barely gave the deputy a chance to speak before pointing toward the back bedroom. "They're still fighting," she said. The deputy moved swiftly through the house, his trained ears listening for the chaos he expected. Yelling, struggling, some sign of the altercation Latoya had described. But there was nothing. The house was eerily quiet. When he reached the back bedroom, his eyes locked onto the scene in the corner. Kevon was there. And so was Alexus. But something was wrong. Watkins had Alexus pinned down, his body hovering over hers. The grip wasn't frantic, wasn't wild. It was controlled, unnervingly so. "Let go of her," Deputy Munguia ordered. No response. Kevon didn't flinch. Again, firmer this time. "Let her go." A pause. Then finally Kevon obeyed. And that's when the deputy saw it. Alexus' body just kind of flopped. The way she fell, limp, lifeless, made the deputy's stomach drop. He took a sharp step forward, eyes scanning the unnatural way her limbs rested against the floor. Her tongue hung loosely from her mouth. Her body showed she had urinated on herself. With a swift motion, Deputy Munguia dropped to her side, fingers pressing desperately against her neck. Nothing. He reached for his radio, his voice firm but quick. "I need additional units and medical assistance. Now." Then, without hesitation, he began CPR. Each compression was a silent plea. "Breathe." The room, the house, the whole world seemed to shrink down to this moment. One officer, one unconscious girl, and the sound of his hands pressing against her chest in a fight against time. The sirens were coming. But was it too late? His pulse pounded in his ears as he continued CPR. His body running on pure adrenaline. He barely registered the sound of footsteps, more deputies, more first responders flooding into the house. A paramedic dropped to his knees, immediately assessing Alexus. "No response," he muttered, already reaching for his bag. Another checked her vitals, their movements urgent but controlled. A stretcher was rushed inside. Latoya stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clenched together. The seconds stretched unbearably long as they lifted Alexus onto the stretcher and rushed her out to the waiting ambulance. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the early evening as the sirens wailed, carrying her away. She was rushed to Navicent Health, a medical center in Hemlock Street, Macon, Georgia. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked furiously to bring Alexus back. Her body fought, weakly, but it fought. After relentless efforts, they resuscitated her. A fragile heartbeat flickered on the monitor, but the damage had already taken hold. Machines now did the work her body could no longer manage on its own. The beeping monitors filled the sterile room, each sound a reminder of how close she had come to never making it this far. Her diagnosis was grim. Cardiorespiratory failure with an anoxic brain injury. The lack of oxygen had starved her brain. It was unclear if she would ever wake up, or if deep inside any part of Alexus was still there. Her family hovered nearby, waiting for a miracle. Then her heart stopped again. The hospital staff did everything they could, but the second cardiac arrest was a final, merciless blow. Alexus's body was failing, one system at a time. The damage to her brain was irreversible. Organs began shutting down, one by one. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a surrender, a slow unraveling of life, slipping beyond reach. By the time the next day arrived, the machines were the only thing keeping her alive. And then, they weren't. The doctor's report was definitive. Anoxic brain injury, the kind caused by prolonged deprivation of oxygen, the kind that left no chance of survival. They documented the official cause of death as asphyxiation. The finality of it weighed heavy on everyone who had fought to save her. Even though it was clear that Alexus had died at the hands of her younger brother, an autopsy was still required. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, appointed a medical examiner to determine the full extent of her injuries. The medical examiner's findings gave a horrific and undeniable picture of what had happened to Alexus as Kevon had her in a chokehold. On her neck were telltale signs of a friction-type injury, evidence of sustained pressure grinding against her skin. The deep abrasion to her sternocleidomastoid muscle, a thick band of tissue running along the side of her neck, suggested not just force but unrelenting pressure, enough to compress the very structures that supplied blood to her brain. According to medical information, the human brain can typically survive without oxygen for around 4 to 5 minutes before significant brain damage starts to occur. Brain cells can begin dying within minutes of oxygen deprivation. Permanent brain damage can start to happen after only a few minutes without oxygen. The longer the brain is deprived of oxygen, the more severe the potential damage. A chokehold kills in 2 ways. First, it causes airway obstruction, also known as asphyxiation. The choke applies pressure directly to the trachea or the windpipe, blocking airflow into the lungs. Secondly, it also causes vascular restrictions. Pressure is applied to the carotid arteries on the sides of the neck when in chokehold, reducing or cutting off blood flow to the brain. And victim may lose consciousness within 5 to 10 seconds due to lack of oxygenated blood to the brain. Our brains need oxygen to survive. If the hold is maintained for longer than 30 seconds to a minute, brain damage or brain death can occur due to cerebral hypoxia or oxygen deprivation. Alexus was in a chokehold for approximately 15 minutes, until the deputy arrived at 5:30 p.m., 15 harrowing minutes of her body fighting for oxygen. 15 minutes where every desperate gasp for air was met with nothing. 15 minutes where her brain starved of the oxygen it so desperately needed, before it began shutting down, cell by cell, second by second. The medical examiner was just as clear about something else. If she had been released within 1 or 2 minutes, she would have lived. When Watkins was later questioned by investigator Marcus Baker, he didn't deny what had happened. His words were cold, detached. He admitted to putting Alexus in the chokehold. He admitted to holding her even after she stopped moving. Because he was mad. He was charged with felony murder and aggravated assault. The trial wasn't long, but for the Watkins family, it must have felt like an eternity. On August 1st and 2nd, 2019, Kevon Watkins stood before a judge, his fate hanging in the balance. He had waived his right to a jury trial, placing his future entirely in the hands of a single judge. In legal terms, this was known as a bench trial, where a judge, rather than a jury, examines the evidence and delivers the final verdict. But this case wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about what kind of crime had been committed. The courtroom saw many witnesses, but perhaps the most unexpected was DeAndre Thomas, Alexus's fiancé and the father of her 3-year-old child. When he walked in to testify, his hands were cuffed, and he wore an orange jumpsuit. Thomas was serving a 20-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter. In 2017, just a year before Alexus's death, he shot and killed 25-year-old Kareem Mano during an argument over a cell phone. Yes, that was Alexus's fiancé. And as he stood before the judge testifying about the household dynamics in the Watkins household, his words revealed a home where discipline had long since lost its meaning. He said it was normal for Kevon to disrespect his mother, to fight with his siblings, and to face little to no consequences. The violence had been brewing for years, and now it has reached its breaking point. As the judge reviewed her notes, she reflected deeply on what had unfolded. One of the things that kept coming to mind was what we ignore, we empower, she said. In this household, chaos was empowered. In this household, the ability to ignore and follow corrective discipline was empowered. Kevon's legal team didn't deny that Alexus had died at his hands. The evidence was undeniable. Instead, they fought to change the charge. They argued that this wasn't felony murder but voluntary manslaughter, a crime that carries a much lighter sentence. The difference? Intent. Voluntary manslaughter happens in the heat of the moment. A crime of passion fueled by extreme emotional distress. There must be provocation, something so overwhelming that it causes a person to lose control and react violently. A sudden fight. A burst of rage. An action taken without time to think. But felony murder, it doesn't require intent to kill, only that a death occurs during the commission of a felony. In Kevon's case, the felony was aggravated assault, the act of choking Alexus. Kevon's lawyers argued that he hadn't meant to kill her, that emotions had gotten the best of him, that the situation had spiraled out of control, that it was a tragic accident, not murder. But the judge saw it differently. Kevon had held his sister in a chokehold for 15 minutes, long enough for any reasonable person to realize the danger. His mother had screamed for him to stop. His younger brother had called 911. Alexus had gone limp in his arms, and yet he never let go. This wasn't a moment of lost control. This was felony murder. The judge made his ruling. Kevon Watkins was found guilty of felony murder and aggravated assault, though the latter charge was merged into the former for sentencing purposes, meaning he would not receive additional time for the second charge. But the courtroom wasn't done with him yet. On August 6, 2019, the final blow came. Watkins was sentenced to life in prison for felony murder. No possibility of early release. No second chances. But Kevon wasn't ready to accept his fate. He filed a motion for a new trial, hoping for a reversal. His request was denied on December 2, 2019. Refusing to give up, he appealed the conviction, still arguing that he should have been convicted of voluntary manslaughter instead. The case reached the Georgia Supreme Court, where justices took another hard look at the facts. Kevon's last hope rested in their hands. But their ruling was swift and final. The court affirmed the original conviction, stating that there was no reversible error and that the evidence did not support a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. Kevon's fate was sealed. One life was lost. Another was locked away forever. In the end, a mother lost both her children over a Wi-Fi password and a video game.